Over the next few weeks, we're looking in our Sunday mornings at 4 of Isaiah's servant songs. 4 songs about God's servant, written 700 years or so before Jesus lived, and yet 4 songs that point to him and are fulfilled in him. Isaiah's original audience was the people of Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, who in around 600 BC were invaded and taken into exile by the Babylonian Empire. They were God's people. God dwelt with them in Jerusalem. He promised to bless the whole world through them, but now the temple is destroyed and they're captives in a foreign land, victims of the fairly barbaric Babylonians. So if you were a Jew in exile in Babylon, you're probably wondering what God is going to do to sort out all the things that are wrong in your world. Does he care about our situation? Why doesn't he do something about it? Don't we sometimes ask similar questions about God when we see the latest horror in the news, 49 dead at the hands of a gunman? When the test results come back from the doctor and it's not the news that we were hoping for. When the boss says that we're not needed anymore, or when life just really hasn't gone how we'd hoped or expected. God, if you're really God, why won't you do something that's wrong? Do something about everything that's wrong in the world. Isaiah's preaching ministry had been about 100 years before Judah were taken into exile, and he'd warned about it. If a Jew in exile in Babylon had read the first 39 chapters of Isaiah, they would have heard very clearly that their nation had rejected God. They'd provoked his just anger, and they'd brought his justice down on themselves in judgment. And so the question of whether God cares becomes even more personal. What's his plan for all that's wrong in his world? Will he bring justice? And if he does, is that good news for us? Because we've been on the wrong side of his justice so far. God has given us to the Babylonians for the things that we've done wrong. It would be natural for you and me to have the same qualms about God's justice. We need him to fix our problems, but what if he condemns us for our sin instead? We love having guests with us here at St. Peter's. If that's you, then maybe you've been given exactly this kind of impression of God from the Christian church. We Christians can sometimes behave as those who have a really clear idea of what's wrong with everybody else. You shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be living like that. Is that how God's justice operates? Nothing but condemnation. As soon as we think about God's justice, it's clear we have 2 opposite problems. Our world of injustice and evil and suffering needs a God who will do something about the mess. And yet, if God acts with justice, what will his justice do with me? On the one hand, we need God's justice, and on the other hand, we're terrified by it. In Isaiah 42, God tells us his plan to sort out what's wrong with the world. It centers on the figure he calls his servant, and it's great news. We're going to see 2 things about God's servant, and if we understand them both, then we'll find there's comfort for everything that's wrong out there, and there's comfort for everything that's wrong in here. Here's the first thing to see about God's servant. The servant is God's instrument of justice. The servant's God's instrument of justice. Will you look down at the first verse of chapter 42? Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I'll put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. God's servant has been chosen by God for the special purpose of bringing his justice to the world. Twice more in these verses, we're told that the servant is about bringing justice. You can see it at the end of verse 3, can't you? In faithfulness, he will bring forth justice. Verse 4, he will not falter or be discouraged until he establishes justice on earth. You see, God looks at the world and agrees with us that things are not as they should be. And he cares deeply about justice. I'm a Stephen Fry fan. I don't know how familiar you are with Stephen Fry. I liked him when he was hosting QI. I love him in Jeeves and Worcester. Stephen Fry doesn't believe in God, but a few years ago, an interviewer said to him, suppose it's true, and one day you meet the Christian God, what will you say to him? This was his reply. Bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain? It's a powerful argument. We live in a world where injustice is normal and evil is everywhere and things are so clearly wrong. Stephen Fry's conclusion is that if there were a God, he must not care about goodness and justice. God says, look at my servant. He will bring justice. In fact, God's servant brings the justice the whole world has been and is waiting for. Look at the end of verse 4. In his law, the islands will put their hope. Talking about the islands is, I think, a poetic way of saying the ends of the earth. So in other words, this servant's law, his teaching, his rule, is the justice the whole world longs for. It's not just Stephen Fry who wants justice, everyone wants justice. Not only in the sense of punishment for those who've done wrong, but in the sense of everything being made right. Justice here means salvation in its broadest sense. It's the life where all of creation is ordered and functioning according to God's design. Elsewhere, Isaiah says that God will swallow up death forever when his glory and justice fill the whole earth. What would it be like if God's judgment on sin no longer hung over creation, so that life no longer heads towards death, because there's no more sin left for God to judge? No more sin, so no more death. That's the justice God is talking about bringing about with his servant. Imagine a world where there's nothing that you could point at and say, that is wrong. A world where God's ways are followed so closely that no one ever lets you down or tells a lie or breaks a promise. Think about a world where people forget about themselves and genuinely love and look out for others, with evil eradicated and selfishness extinct. It seems an impossibly good level of justice, doesn't it? 1,000 years before Isaiah, Moses had brought justice through God's law, the Ten Commandments. But Moses couldn't stop people murdering. And 2,500 years after Isaiah, we try to organize society to bring about justice. We redistribute wealth to reduce inequality. But we can't stop people being greedy. We educate the next generation to increase justice, but we cannot stop human beings being selfish. But this servant will be different. He's God's chosen servant. Verse 1, I uphold him. I will put my spirit on him. And who is the God who's saying this? Well, look down at verse 5. This is what God the Lord says, he who created the skies and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and all that comes out of it, who gives breath to its people and life to those who walk on it. Verse 6, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand, I will keep you, and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. The Bible says that we have turned from the God of light and we live in darkness. We're blind to the goodness of God and the goodness of his ways, and we've chosen our own version of justice. so that we live in a prison of pride and self-love. But through his servant, the same God who created this world will free captives, will release from its dungeon the world, and bring the universe back to his glory. Verse 9 says this kind of justice will be a new thing. That's not wrong, is it? To bring real and total justice will take something more radical than humankind has ever seen or could ever do ourselves. Only the Creator God could do it. And verse 5 says that he is the one who will do it. The God who first gave life to us will one day bring justice on his earth through his servant. The servant is God's instrument of justice. It sounds like glorious news, and it is. But is it good news for us? The word translated justice here could also be translated judgment. The servant will bring God's judgment. That's not really any different from bringing God's justice. To bring justice, God has to judge and wipe out everything that's wrong in the world. Which raises the question for us, what side of God's judgment are we going to fall on? And that takes us to our second point, because as well as being God's instrument of justice, the servant is also God's instrument of grace. The servant is God's instrument of grace. Without grace, God's justice is terrifying news for us. The people of Israel knew lots about that. God had made them his people to live for him and to walk in his ways. That's the best way for any of us to do life, with God in his rightful place. None of our desires can ultimately be satisfied unless we're in right relationship with the God that everything glorious comes from. But by nature, we're all glory thieves. Instead of living for the glory of God, we try to steal that glory for ourselves. We don't love God and love all that he's made, but we love ourselves. The Bible calls it sin. It ruins our lives. It hurts the people around us. And ultimately, it brings God's judgment on us. Verse 8 in our passage, I will not give my glory to another. God will not forever stand by while humankind refuses to live with him as God and breaks his justice. That's why the Old Testament Jews had gone into exile. The human reason was that the Babylonian Empire was massive and the kingdom of Judah was overrun. But Isaiah has spent 39 chapters of his book explaining that the spiritual reason for their exile was their sin. So is God's justice actually something we can welcome? The Bible is clear that everyone has sinned and falls short of the glory of God. There's no one good enough for God. So it's not obvious that a God of justice is actually good news for us. It certainly wasn't obvious to the Israelites, but here's how Isaiah started his message in chapter 40. A famous verse, comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Isaiah is bringing a message of comfort. How can God's justice be comforting for you and for me, given the way that we have related to the God of this universe? The answer is found by looking again at the servant in chapter 42. There's something very surprising about this servant's justice. Verse 1, God's Spirit is on him. Way back in Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah prophesied that God's Spirit would rest on a descendant of the great King David. So when we hear of the Spirit resting on him, we're expecting a kingly figure, and he's upheld by God's strength, we're told. So at this point, I think we're probably expecting God's justice to come through a powerful, evil-conquering, kingly rule, a king of perfect justice, who will crush all those who disobey God. But look at the picture painted of the servant by verse 2 and 3. He will not shout or cry out, or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. It's a picture, isn't it, of gentleness. The next verse, verse 4, is hard to translate into English, so we lose a little bit of the Hebrew poetry. He will not falter or be discouraged. The words for falter and discouraged are the same words that we just had in verse 3. So the word translated falter literally means to be faint or to be dim or smouldering, so like a candle wick that is only just glowing. And the word translated discouraged literally means bruised. So verse 3 says that the servant doesn't break bruised reeds or snuff out faintly glowing wicks. And verse 4 says this about the servant: he himself will not grow faint or be bruised. You see, the servant is gentle with the bruised and with the faint, but he is not like them. He is the truly just and faithful one. He is no glory thief. Everybody else lives in darkness, but God's light burns brightly in his servant. He's the truly righteous one who we expect to extinguish those not shining brightly with God's justice. But he doesn't. The servant comes across a bruised reed, damaged partway up the leaf, never going to stand straight again. We expect him to break it off. His job is to bring God's perfect justice. Why is he being so gentle with a reed that is clearly not what it should be, not fit for purpose? And why won't he snuff out the smouldering wick? Flick over the page, will you, to chapter 43, verse 17. It's a verse recalling how God judged the Egyptians 1,000 years earlier. Chapter 43, verse 17. They lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. So snuffing out like a wick is an image of judgment. And that's the servant's great task after all, isn't it? He does not falter. He does not burn faintly. He burns brightly with God's light. He's come to bring God's justice. So why isn't he snuffing out these smouldering wicks? That is exactly the confusion people experienced when Jesus Christ began his ministry. Around 700 years after Isaiah's prophecies, a man called Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And John saw the Spirit of God come down on Jesus like a dove, and he heard a voice from heaven say, "This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." He could almost have been reading Isaiah 42 verse 1, couldn't he? "My chosen one in whom I delight." Jesus was God's chosen servant. He is God's chosen servant, and he lived a life of perfect righteousness. Nobody had ever seen such kindness or such integrity or selflessness. Jesus loved like nobody else. He was the light of the world. And people who thought that they were righteous got to know Jesus and suddenly realized that they weren't. He was the brightly shining one, the unbruised one. But he hadn't come to judge just yet. That was the shock. He was very clear that God had made him the judge and that one day he would bring his kingdom of justice. But that wasn't why he came into the world the first time. If you're new to Christian things, this is one of the most beautiful things to see about Jesus. Pick up a Bible and read one of the 4 gospel accounts of his life. He's the light of the world, undeniably living a life of justice, never seen before or since. And yet he doesn't put out a smouldering wick. He was famous for befriending sinners and unmentionables. The crowd wanted to stone the woman caught in adultery. Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." No one could. And Jesus, who really was without sin, chose not to. As he's dying on a Roman cross, executed by jealous enemies, he prays, "Father, forgive them." No one would have guessed that God's servant of perfect justice would also be a servant of unrestrained grace. He comes to a world full of sinners, and instead of wiping us out so that God can start again with a better batch, instead God sends him, verse 6, to be a covenant for the people, a light for the Gentiles. Covenant relationships are what marriage is supposed to be like, unbreakable promises. Jesus, the servant, is a way for sinners to be in unbreakable covenant relationship with God. Verse 7, freed from the prison of our sinful hearts, released from the dungeon of darkness. Do you see the gentleness of Jesus' grace? Verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. You might be very aware of being a bruised reed. How could God want me? I'm broken and weak and unreliable. He can't depend on me after my past, can he? I am not going to be much use in Jesus' service. Well, this servant won't break you. He won't snap you off and throw you away. When you're bruised, he'll heal you. He'll find a place for you in his plans. Or perhaps you're more like a smouldering wick. Once your walk with Jesus was a bright flame, but now you've kind of neglected that flame. The flicker of your spiritual life is all but out. You're ashamed to approach God for fear that he'll snuff you out because you're so feeble. But no, this servant will not snuff out a smouldering wick. This servant pulls us back from extinction and gets us burning brightly again. God's servant, Jesus, says to any of us, there's a place for you in my service. Messed up, broken people are Jesus' speciality. We live in a world of injustice, crying out for a God of justice, and yet each of us unable on our own to survive his justice. And Jesus the servant is God's instrument of both justice and grace. Two characteristics we would not have imagined could go so perfectly together. We look at the world and the circumstances of our lives and we wonder why God doesn't deal with all that is wrong. It's not that he's deserted us. He's not uncaring about our suffering and pain. He's neither distant nor powerless. To get rid of all wrong now would mean destroying sinners, breaking off all the bruised reeds and snuffing us all out. So instead, John 3, verse 16, God sent his Son into the world to die so that we wouldn't have to. Anyone who believes in Jesus, who puts their lives in his hands, will be given a life forever after death, on an earth filled with justice. Jesus is God's instrument of justice. One day he will establish God's justice on all the earth, but he's also God's instrument of grace. Jesus came first not to flatten rebels, but to restore them. And so in this world where things really are wrong and where we're part of the problem, we can look at the God of justice and be comforted. Look at his servant Jesus and take comfort both from his perfect justice and also his gentle grace. I'm going to leave a moment of quiet for us to respond in our own hearts to God, to Isaiah 42, and then we'll respond together. A moment of quiet.